Okay, thank you so much for having me. Really, it's supposed to share some Torah here, especially about Inyane Shmitta. It's very, sometimes people think of it being so difficult. It's not somewhat commonly learned, but there's some really gishmaka pieces of alumnus that Mitzvah Hashem will be able to explore a little bit today. So first of all, I wanted to, I actually was planning on speaking, as you are learning, introducing all about the halachos of eating פירות שביעית, how much of a mitzvah there is to do such a thing, so on and so forth. But I actually wanted to start with something that caught my eye today from the Daf Yomi. I wasn't planning on it, but it was just so exciting to me this morning that I wanted to share it with you guys. So I don't know how many of you are learning the Daf Yomi, but I'll tell over what the Gemara says. I'll relate what the Gemara says, and Mitzvah Hashem, we can use that as a bit of a springboard. So the Gemara is talking about the scientific fact, and the way that it works is that when a person plants something in the ground, when a person does an act of zriya, a maisa zriya, there's not an immediate effect. The seeds don't automatically take root. In the words of the Gemara, to be held in the ground is a liklot, to have a lakita. So a klita, to take hold, for it to be considered one with the ground, that doesn't happen right away. You put the seed in, you can cover it with soil, but then you can try to expedite the process, but halachically, it's not considered to become one with the soil. It's not considered niklat. There's not a klita in the karka. It doesn't become a substance that is planted in the ground immediately. And the Gemara's daf today, we were discussing the complexity of precisely how long does it take. So there are different views in the Gemara. When a person plants something, how long does it take before it germinates, before we see that it becomes exactly one with the ground? So it's depending on obviously, probably depends exactly what you're planting. But in the context of today's Gemara, we were talking about somebody planting a sapling. And the question is, how long does it take before it's niklat in the ground, before it takes place, that we see that this thing is something planted? So there are different views. One opinion in the Gemara, the Tanakama wanted to say that it was 30 days. We had an opinion from Rabbi Yehuda that even just 3 days. We had an opinion from Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, who were saying 2 weeks. A bunch of different ideas, the complexity there in the Tanam about precisely the amount of time that it takes before, when I plant something in the ground, before the klita takes place. And this idea of the klita is very important. For example, in our Gemara today, we were talking about the laws of Arla. So if there's a law of Arla, when a tree is already growing, so it has to be wait 3 years before you're allowed to eat the fruit. So the question is that even if it's only a partial amount of year, but a partial amount of a year can also be considered a year, as long as it was in the ground, it was growing before Rosh Hashanah, and it was considered a tree. It was considered to be something which was kalat in the ground. Then when Rosh Hashanah comes, then it's considered that it had a complete first year, even if it hadn't been there for 365 days. Even just a partial year could be considered a first year, as long as it was already considered to be a tree in the ground. It wasn't just, some sapling that was attached to the ground. It was a way to do more. It was a way more where we were able to see that it actually became a tree in the ground. And the point that the Gemara here is saying is that we got to make sure that it was in the ground for a certain amount of time before it's going to be niklat. So if I planted, let's say, a few days, I put the sapling in the ground just a few days before the Shmitta year starts, well, that's not going to be considered that it was niklat. It's not going to be considered that it was actually in the ground and is a growing tree before Rosh Hashanah, and that partial year is not going to count as a year of Arla. But the Gemara says if it was in the ground for 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, then it's going to be considered that it was niklat. It's going to be considered as if it took root, as if it was already a tree in the ground. And since it was a tree growing in the ground, then even though it was only a partial year, it would be considered a full year, like a full year pass for the laws of Arla. And then it would continue. It would continue from after Rosh Hashanah already be considered in its second year. These were the laws that the Gemara taught us this morning here in the Daf Yomi. So the question here to think about is that the Gemara then moved on to discuss this in parameters of Shmitta. So in Shmitta, we know a few things. The Torah says you're not allowed to work the land. The Torah says you're not allowed to plant in the field. So during the Shmitta, a person would go ahead and they would plant something in the field. Well, then they would be over. They would be transgressing the Isra that the Torah says. The Torah says that you're not allowed to plant your field. If you plant during your field during Shmitta, you're doing the wrong thing. That is an Isra. But how does this translate into some of these nuances where you're putting a seed in the ground, but it doesn't necessarily take root right away? It takes root at a later point. So, for example, what we were looking at today was, let's say I would put something in the ground before the Shmitta starts. But then it's going to take hashrash, it's going to take root, it's going to be niklat in the ground after the Shmitta year would already begin. In that situation, has a person done any sense of wrongdoing? Is there anything wrong that they have done in that case? It's a pretty hard thing to examine because on the one hand, you're putting it in the ground before the Shemitah year is beginning, but on the other hand, it's taking root, it's taking effect, it's becoming a planted item. It's becoming a planted item already once this Shemitah year has already begun. So it's interesting because there's a passivity here versus the activity of the person. The activity of the person, which is putting it in the ground, but that doesn't necessarily have an effect right away. And then there's the passive effect, which the ground, where the person is doing nothing, but the ground is able to take effect onto the things that were planted into it. It's now niklat in the ground, and now it becomes a planted item. And the question here is one violating anything? Is there any wrongdoing in such a situation where a person puts it in the ground ahead of time before the Shemitah, but then during the Shemitah year itself, there is an effect of where it becomes a planted item? So it seems in our Gemara, and this is a proof which I saw from the Minchas Chinuch, that there is very much an issue with such a thing. Even if somebody does not do any action whatsoever during the Shemitah year, in fact, they are putting it in the ground before the Shemitah year begins. And just to stay clear of this issue, they're putting it in the ground before even the Tosefes Shemitah begins, even the time that we're meant to add on to the Shemitah year, even before that time. Before that, if he puts it in the ground, but then it's being niklat during the time of Tosefes Shvius or during the time of Shemitah year itself, certainly, then the halacha is the rabbis penalize the person who has such a thing done, and they say that he is required to uproot the tree which has taken root. So even though the action's not taking place during the time when the Torah says not to plant, the action took place before, the action took place ahead of time, before the time of the Shemitah. But once it's taking root now, once there's a klita now, which takes place during the time of Shemitah, Chazal penalize the person and they require him to uproot it. Now the penalty, it seems like based upon the Gemara in Gittin, the penalty is for wrongdoing. The penalty is because it's like a violation for you've done the wrong thing here. You've planted during the Shemitah year, so therefore we have to hold there's a responsibility for that. And the Torah, and even though the Torah doesn't require this, but the rabbis come along and they say, we have to uproot everything that the action has done. So if the action has created a klita on the ground, and now this thing has taken root in the ground, we have to make sure that there's no benefit from it, has to be taken away and uprooted, and that is the halacha of Yaakov. So to summarize the point, what the Gemara is saying is that even if a person has not planted during the Shemitah year itself, but they have enabled that the ground will now take root of something which they placed in the ground before Shemitah, there is wrongdoing in that. There is something wrong. There is an isser that is being violated in this case. And because of that, the rabbis are requiring a person to uproot that plant and to take it out of the ground. This is pretty much the information which was said in the Gemara this morning. Now, the Minchas Chinuch wonders how we can compare and contrast that with the laws of Shabbos. Now, let's imagine for a second, we're going to start on the opposite extreme, just to bring out the point and get the lumdus flowing here a little bit. So in the laws of Shabbos, one of the malachos is zoreah. A person is not allowed to plant on Shabbos. So there's a very well-known thought of the Minchas Chinuch, where he wonders, how is it that anyone is ever violating such a malacha? How is it possible to violate a malacha of planting on Shabbos? And the question is that if there's no immediate effect to what I've done, all I've done is put something in the ground, but it hasn't taken root. It doesn't take root on the same day. It takes 3 days, 2 weeks, 30 days, whatever amount of time. But if there's no immediate effect, and all it is, as if in the words of the Gemara, command mancha b'kada, which means it is tantamount to just storing something in a jug. Putting something in the ground, what are you doing exactly? You plant it, that's an act of planting. All you did is you store it in a jug. After 3 days, 30 days, 2 weeks, whenever the effect is felt, now the item becomes a planted item. And certainly you've achieved that through your action, which you triggered. You are the catalyst for that point. But to say that on Shabbos I planted when I put something into the ground, that seems like an overstatement. How is it considered that I planted something when I put a seed into the ground on Shabbos? So this is a problem which the Minchas Chinuch addresses. So one approach you may be tempted to say is, well, as long as it ends up being planted, who cares that the effect didn't happen on Shabbos? You enable that effect to happen. So on Shabbos, I put it in the ground. So whenever the effect happens, we'll connect it to what your action was. We'll relate that effect happened because of what you did. And since it happened because of what you did, then maybe you're liable for Shabbos, despite the fact that the effect was not felt immediately on the Shabbos. You might be tempted to jump into that conclusion. But drawing a very interesting parallel, the Minchas Chinuch challenges that conclusion. He challenges it from a case where somebody would put bread into an oven right before the end of Shabbos. Imagine this, just a minute or two before sunset on Shabbos afternoon, a person puts the bread into an oven. Would you say that he violates Shabbos for baking that bread in the oven if he puts it in very close to the sunset? So here as well, it doesn't bake on Shabbos. The effect is not immediate. Doesn't become a baked item until later. So can you say that I baked on Shabbos? I didn't bake on Shabbos. I enabled it. I triggered it. I'm the catalyst for it. I put it in the oven. But then that effect of the baked item becoming a baked item really only takes place after Shabbos. So over there, the Minchas Chinuch assumes, this is his assumption. There are those who disagree with him on this point, but his assumption is that a person would in fact not be liable because they didn't bake on Shabbos. All they did was put it into the oven. But putting something into the oven is not that different than just putting the bread into a pantry. What have I done? Happens to be that this pantry is a very hot pantry. But it's not, you can't define that as an act of cooking if it didn't cook. So if it cooked later, that's great, but then I didn't cook on the Shabbos. So if we assume that point to be true, and we assume that if somebody puts something into an oven right by the end of Shabbos, and it cooks only after Shabbos is complete, we're going to assume that the person is in fact exempt. They are not liable. They are not held accountable for baking on the Shabbos. Then the Minchas Chinuch wonders, well, why don't we say exactly the same thing when it comes time to planting? Why don't we say exactly the same parallel, that if somebody puts something into the ground on Shabbos, it does not have an immediate effect. It does not become a planted item. We don't view the thing as being connected to the ground at all. So why in the world can't I plant on Shabbos? What wrongdoing is there in putting a seed into the ground on Shabbos? What malacha? How is that a malacha? What act did I do? I put it into the ground. So I put it in a jug. It happens to be the jug. This is, surrounded with soil, but that's not an act of planting. Why is that an act of planting? There's no effect whatsoever. This is the question that the Minchas Chinuch addresses. Really deep, great question to think about. Again, the pushback on him would have been to say, maybe if the effect eventually comes, we'll connect it to your action and we'll say that this was your action and you planted on the Shabbos. The Minchas Chinuch is rejecting that suggestion because he's saying, if you'd say that, then why don't you say the same thing with baking as well? Why don't I say that if I put something in the oven right at the end of Shabbos, even if it only became a baked item after Shabbos, I should be liable because I am connected to that. I, on Shabbos, put it in the oven and made that come about. If we don't say it in the case of baking, and we say that unless the effect was felt on Shabbos, unless you made it a baked item on the Shabbos itself, then you're not held liable, then we should suggest the same thing for planting. We should suggest that with planting as well, you shouldn't be held liable unless it actually took root, unless there was a klita which took place on Shabbos itself. And trusting that the Gemara seems to be saying here that there's more of an amount of time which has to pass before the klita will occur, it has to be 3 days, 2 weeks, or 30 days, and it seems pretty impossible to come up here with a case of how somebody's ever going to be liable for the malacha of planting on the Shabbos. This is the problem. So the Minchas Chinuch solves this by just slicing a little lumdus here. And he explains it's not so easy. And it almost sounds like it's philosophy to a certain degree about the analysis of an act of cooking versus an act of planting. But he says that we have to distinguish between the two. An act of baking is not putting something in the context where it will bake. The act of baking, the malacha of ofes / bishul, is defined by its effect. It's defined by the outcome of the fact that it is a baked item. And if I'm missing that outcome, then I don't view it as a ma'aseh malacha at all. I don't view it as an action of malacha. I don't view that someone who stuck something into an oven is doing an act of bishul. It's not true. If I put it into the oven and it bakes, that effect is what gives my ma'aseh now the significance of an act of bishul. But without the effect happening, there's no act of zriya at all. There's no act of of baking. There's no act of cooking whatsoever. But zriya is different. An act of planting is putting something into the ground. That's an act of planting. Even if there's no effect, whichever it comes, and even if it doesn't end up taking root, it's an act of planting. And there's in what I am doing as a person, and then there's the effect that the ground has upon the seed. But since I put it into the ground, that itself is defined as an act of planting. Regardless of whether or not it ever takes root, one has planted. In other words, for some reason with planting, we do not allow the effect to define what the action is. Something is defined as an act of planting, irrespective of whether or not it ever takes roots. Now, that's a very interesting idea, because when we analyze where the state of the seeds or the sapling or the chefs or whatever item you planted, there we're going to say that the item is not considered to be a planted item. The item is not considered one with the ground. It's not considered a tree in regard to the laws of Arla, for example, unless it is niklat in the ground, unless there is some deep rooting that it has connected to the ground. Without that, we're just going to say it's as if it's in a jug, and for example, you would be exempt. But that's all, and it's not considered growing from the ground in the laws of HaRav. But that all those points are in regard to the item. Those are all in regard to the way that we view the state of the thing that is connected to the ground, the thing that's in the ground. But when I want to know what did the person do, when I want to know the maisa of the gavra, when I want to understand what is the person doing, he is doing an act of planting before there is any rooting which takes place in the item which he has placed. So this is a really interesting lumdis that the Minchas Chinuch comes up with. By bishul and afiyah, we say that the maisa bishul and the maisa afiyah is only defined if there is an effect of baking or cooking which takes place in the item. If I take away that variable, if I remove the effect of baking, I have no act of bishul. And since I have no act of bishul, if I put that into the oven right before the end of Shabbos, there is no wrongdoing. I haven't done a maisa malacha. Since it's not baking on Shabbos, you can't say that I baked on Shabbos. I didn't bake on Shabbos. The effect is not there in the bread. Well, then it's not going to be considered that I did an act of baking. But Zriya doesn't work like that. The act of planting is not defined by the effect that it has. The act of planting is an act of planting unto itself. And even before there is a taking root which takes place on the item, and the item didn't become a planted item, and the chefsa itself is really just in a jug, but I planted it because I put that in the ground. This is a very interesting dichotomy that we're working with. The gavra has performed an act of zriya, fascinating stuff. There's an act of zriya which he has done by putting it in the ground, but the item itself is not considered to be a planted item until it takes root. So because of this, if I put something into the ground on Shabbos, I'm liable. The effect wasn't felt until later. That doesn't matter. Even though the effect wasn't felt until later, I am still liable. And to bring out the point even more, it would seem that according to the Minchas Chinuch, even if I would remove it from the ground after Shabbos and I take it away, that doesn't remove my liability. The bottom line is I still did an act of planting. Again, the item never became planted afterwards. But the bottom line is that I planted. So you wouldn't run into a problem. Let's say, you're warning a person. You're saying, hey, don't plant on Shabbos. He'll say, you know what? I'm going to plant. Maybe afterwards I'll pull it out. So who said I planted? No, you planted by putting it in the ground. Masha'enkin, when there's an afiyah type of situation, then we look at it very differently. When it's an afiyah type of situation, putting something into the oven is only an act of baking because of the fact that the effect will come out. Now, I just want to clarify a point, is that this doesn't mean that if I put something into an oven before Shabbos begins, that then I'm held liable if it bakes on Shabbos. On a Doraisa level, I'm not liable for that. Because in that situation, I didn't do the Maisa on Shabbos. The effect came on Shabbos, but the Maisa happened before. You need both points together. In other words, what you have both points together is that you cannot put in something into an oven on Shabbos if it will bake on Shabbos. If those two variables are present, then you baked on Shabbos. Great. If I put it into the oven before Shabbos and it baked on Shabbos, I didn't do it on Shabbos. Or the opposite. If I put it into the oven right before the end of Shabbos and then it baked on Shabbos, I also didn't bake on Shabbos. Either way, in order for it to be a maisa bishul, it has to be I put it in the oven and it baked on Shabbos. Masha'enkin by Zriya, the Minchas Chinuch is telling us this really deep lumdus that when I put the seed into the ground, that's an act of Zriya. I'm chayiv on Shabbos, despite the fact that it didn't take root until after Shabbos is over. This is one point. And he says this all would be true, not just in the laws of Shabbos. Now let's take this philosophy further. Let's take this lumdus about Zriya, let's apply it to Shmitta, let's apply it to the Isra of planting Kalayim. Let's say, for example, somebody's planting seeds of Kalayim. He's planting wheat in a vineyard. He's planting a wheat seed. He's putting it down in the ground and it's inside of a vineyard. You're not allowed to do such a thing. Even though it doesn't take root right away, and all you're doing is putting the seed down, and the seed itself won't become forbidden in Mahana. The seed itself won't become an item that is Kilei HaKerem until a later point, only once it takes root and germinates and there's a klita that it has with the ground. But the person has transgressed the Isser of planting Kalayim as soon as he places it in the ground. This is the novelty that the Minchas Chinuch wants to suggest. Again, it's based on the fact that he's creating this dichotomy between the person's action of planting and the effect of the seeds becoming a planted item. It may be that the effect only takes place later. It might only become that the seed is Kilei HaKerem at a later point. It may only become Asr Bahana later. But the person has done something wrong. The person has done the Isser as soon as he has put it inside of the ground. And the same thing, for example, would be true for the laws of Shmitta as well. If let's say it's the end of the Shmitta year, and a person goes outside and he starts planting, he's doing the wrong thing. He's doing the wrong thing. The Torah tells us that we're not allowed to plant during the Shmitta. And if the Torah tells us that we're not allowed to plant during the Shmitta, that means I'm not allowed to put seeds in the ground. The effect that might not take place until after the Shmitta is over. If I do this right the last day of the Shmitta year, am I really doing anything wrong? Why am I doing anything wrong? I didn't do anything wrong. It's no effect. The answer is no, because again, an act of Zriya is not defined through the effect. The act of Zriya is an act of Zriya for itself. And therefore, even though it's not going necessarily to take root until after the Shmitta, one would still transgress the Isser of planting his field during Shmitta if they planted at the tail end of the Shmitta year. That is all one perspective of the Minchas Chai. But now, so let me just summarize that last point. Just what is the key takeaways? The key takeaways are that in regard to a Maisa Zriya, one is doing an act of Zriya even before the thing has any hashrasha, even before there's any klita, even before there's any effect, you consider that you planted. That's why you're chai for planting on Shabbos, even though there's no effect. If I plant seeds of wheat in a karam, I'm chai for planting, even though they don't become kilei karam until they take root. And if somebody planted at the end of Shmita, even if it wouldn't take root until after, now it's already the 8th year, one still has done the wrong thing. One has transgressed this. But let's think about this for a second. Let's go back to the Gemara that we opened with. We opened with a Gemara that spoke about the exact inverse. We opened with a Gemara that said, what about the opposite? Somebody is planting, takes a sapling, and he puts it in the ground before the Shemitah starts. And as Rashi learns the Gemara, even before the time of Tosefes Shemitah started, you're putting it in the dead summer, in the middle of Av. Just make it clear. A person in the middle of Av, in the 6th year, it's going to be the 7th year. The 7th year is upcoming, and you're putting a sapling into the ground. It's not going to take root right away. So are you doing the wrong thing right now? Of course, I'm not doing the wrong thing right now. I didn't do anything, right? It's not Shemitah. I can't be restricted from doing such a thing. Clearly, it's not forbidden right now to place this sapling into the ground. But then it's going to come the time for Shemitah, or the time to add on to the Shemitah year. And during that time, when there are restrictions of the laws of Shemitah, my sapling that I put before Shemitah began, at that point, what happens? There's a klita which takes place. There is a klita which takes place at that point. It becomes rooted to the ground. It becomes connected to the ground. In that moment now, it's nishrash in the karka, becomes one with the ground. Is there anything wrong with that, or is there not? I'm not doing the action now. And remember, the action that the person is not allowed to do is to plant. And we keep on emphasizing that planting is really regardless, irrespective of what ends up happening. But what about the inverse? What about where I planted completely permissibly and it was all fine because it wasn't Shemitah restrictions yet in place? But now there's a klita that's taking place now during the time when there are Shemitah restrictions. What is the law in that scenario? Is there anything wrong? So we see from our daf today that there's an extreme wrongdoing. We're saying that when a person does that, it's so wrong that he has to uproot the tree. That's exactly what the Gemara spoke about. That's exactly what the Mishnah Shemitah is talking about. Someone who plants the tree before the Shemitah year begins, but since it takes 30 days for it to kick in and it takes root during the Shemitah year, the day 30 when it actually takes root is during the time of Shemitah restrictions. The Mishnah is saying that Ya'akar. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. According to the way Rashi learns the Gemara is talking about even in a case where I planted before Tosefes Shvius, before there was anything wrong about planting. I'm planting, let's say, 50 days before the Shemitah year, in the middle of Av, and day 30 will be during the time of Tosefes Shvius. There as well, the Gemara is saying, Ya'akar. I have done nothing wrong at the time that I planted, but the fact that it is taking root and during the time of Shemitah restrictions, during the time of even Tosefes Shvius, according to the opinion of Rashi, the Gemara is saying there's a wrongdoing here. And the wrongdoing makes a penalty. The rabbis penalize the person and they say, Ya'akar, he must uproot that sapling. What did he do wrong? He planted it during Av, at a time when there was no restriction whatsoever to have to make an act of planting. But the fact that it's being niklat now during the time of Shemitah restriction, the halacha is there's wrongdoing at this point. And the wrongdoing at this point, what does it require? It requires him this penalty to kick in, and he has to uproot it at this point. So how do we understand that? How do we relate to that? What did the person do wrong? Why is our Gemara saying here that Ya'akar, that the tree has to be uprooted if I didn't plant it at all during this time? How do we understand this idea? So the Minchas Chinuch has a very bold suggestion. He says it would seem like from our Gemara that if something is taking root, then it's as if you're planting it again. In other words, every time you plant something, what's really happening is that there's a duality. You plant it in the moment, as we pointed out, where I plant, let's say, right at the end of Shmitta, I'm over, even if it doesn't take root till afterwards. You plant it in the moment. You're chayiv on Shabbos, even if there's no effect. But when it actually goes and takes effect, when it actually now becomes connected to the ground, it's as if you're planting again. There's another planting which is taking place. Now, that's so novel, so novel. And he wants to liken it to an example of somebody who wears kalayim. The Gemara tells us that theoretically, if he keeps on being worn not to take it off, then it's as if he's constantly, perpetually wearing it, even though he just put it on originally, right? But it's a continuous action from what he has done. It's as if he's constantly putting on the garment. Maybe it's like that here. You plant it, and then eventually when the effect goes in, it's as if you're planting it again in that moment. And maybe that's the way we're supposed to understand this. We're supposed to understand that when the klita takes effect during the time of Shmitta restriction, maybe we're supposed to understand it's as if you're planting it again, even though it doesn't seem that way. In that moment, it seems you're totally passive. You've moved on. You're not there. You're not out in the field anymore. But maybe we should still understand that it is as if you are doing an action in that moment. However, it's too bothersome to suggest such a thing. And he himself is very disturbed by the notion of such an idea, that when something is taking root after you planted it, it is considered as if you're planting it again. Is that really the way to look at it? Is that true? And he suggests a bold, novel interpretation, which I think is great Yisrael to know for the laws of Shmitta. And he explains that in the laws of Shmitta, there are two separate aspects. There's an aspect about what I am restricted from doing. I, meaning the person, the Gabra who lives in Israel, I am restricted from planting in the land of Israel during the Shmitta. But there's another deed. V'shav sahar Shabbos laHashem. And what that means is that I have to make sure that the ground rests. I have to make sure that my ground does not perform the malachos that the ground normally does. I have to make sure that my ground is not growing things during the Shmitta. He likens this, the parallel that he gives is that in the laws of Shabbos, not only does the Torah say, lo sa'aseh kol malacha, you're restricted from doing work, but it also says, ato bincha, bitecha, avlecha, masecha, behemtecha. We have a lot of other people that can't do work. So, for example, you're not allowed to have your animal do work for you on Shabbos. There's an Isra Aseh, Shvisas Behema. So even if I'm at home, I'm not doing anything wrong. But if my animal is carrying things outside for me on Shabbos in the street, I'm liable. That's the entire Shabbos. Perek and Shabbos is dedicated to discussing what type of thing an animal can carry for me and what type of things they cannot. Because if my animal is carrying for me on Shabbos, then I'm being over on this halacha. I have to make sure, I have to protect that my animals, guard them from doing the malacha for me on Shabbos. So too in the laws of Shmitta. Besides for the fact that you're not allowed to work the land and you're not allowed to plant, there's another din as well. The other din as well is that you can't have your land working for you during the Shmitta year. So he suggests that that's what our Gemara in today's daf was focused on. If I plant during Av, during the 6th year before the Shmitta year is going to start, of course I didn't do any action that was wrong. Of course there was no Maisa of Zriya during the Shmitta year. And even when it takes root during the time of Shmitta restrictions, it's not considered like I'm planting again. Nobody's saying such a thing. However, what we are saying is that I have to make sure there's a daraisa. I'm not doing a lav of planting, but there's a daraisa, there's a mitzvah saseh to make sure that my land is being shovis, to make sure that the land is resting. And if the land is going to be collate my maisas riyah, then the land is working for me. The land is working for me, then I'm violating the laws of Shmitta. So to clarify his chiddush, let's say we would be talking about the laws of Shabbos. If I would plant ahead of Shabbos, 3 days ahead of Shabbos, and I know, and I intend for this to happen, I plan that on Shabbos, the ground is going to work for me, and it's going to be collate my seed, it's going to become rooted to the ground on the Shabbos. Have I done anything wrong? I've done zero wrong. Zero wrong, because on Shabbos, I have to make sure that I don't do malacha, my animals, my family. But I do not have to make sure that the land does not work for me on Shabbos. On Shabbos, there's no such aspect. On Shabbos, I don't have to make sure the land doesn't work for me. I can't do malacha. So I can't plant on Shabbos, again, irrespective of whether there's any effect, but it's a maisas riyah when I plant on Shabbos. But if I'm planting ahead of Shabbos and I'm intending for the ground to work for me, to take my action and connect it to the ground and make it solidify my action, no problem. There's nothing wrong with that. But during Shmitta, there's tremendous wrong with that. Because during Shmitta, besides for the fact that you can't plant during the Shmitta, there's another din, there's another aspect here. And that additional aspect is V'shav sahar Shabbos laHashem, that us who are controlling the land, we are told we have a mitzvah. Mitzvah says to make sure that our ground rests. What does it mean that we are told to make sure our ground rests? More than just saying don't plant the ground. It's much more than that. It is saying you cannot plant the ground even before if you're going to have the intention that the ground will be working for you and making klita for you from your effect of your actions during the Shmitta. This is the novelty that the Minchas Chinuch suggests. Now, I want to bring out just a couple points on thinking about this analysis of this Minchas Chinuch. Point number one is that I'm not sure if you've come across this in your studies yet of Shmitta, but there's a halacha of Shmitta called svichim. Svichim mean that there are many circumstances where a human being doesn't plant anything at all. He's not actively engaged in planting. And yet there are things that are still growing by the land. Just because human beings aren't working the land doesn't mean that the land isn't working. So for example, just the way the science works, you can have some grain which was growing in the 6th year, and it could be the wind rustled and blew through it, and some seeds fell off by themselves and they fell into the ground. And when they fall into the ground, eventually the next year, the ground will grow some more grain. It's not magic, it's science. That's the way it's going to work. Or perhaps when the person was, harvesting some of the grain, he dropped some of the seeds. He didn't even realize, didn't know when the world was going on, and it dropped into the ground. Or the Rishonim tell us even more. There is a phenomenon of sometimes really wild types of things that grow completely without any seeds, without any person or any plants or any seeds falling in. The ground itself is able to produce certain herbage, certain types of grasses and the like, which come even without planting. So if that's true, what is the halacha? How does Shmitta view all those things? Are we allowed to have our ground working for us? So we know that there's a big dispute in the Tanaim. Maybe you'll come across this more about whether or not sifichim are allowed to be eaten, not allowed to be eaten. But the Rabbanan's view is that midaraisa they're allowed to be eaten. Sifichim are mutar. Person didn't plant them during the Shemitah year. He didn't make them grow. They grew by themselves. Me'elehem, they grew by themselves, and therefore you're not restricted from eating them. And nobody, as far as I know, says that you have to go to the sifichim and uproot them while they're growing. In other words, nobody is saying that I have to be nervous if I own a field. Nobody is saying I have to be nervous and make sure that my field is not growing its produce by itself. Never heard of such a halacha. It seems like it's completely permitted to have such a thing done. So it seems just the opposite of what the Minchas Chinuch suggests. It seems that the Minchas Chinuch was telling us that besides for the fact that I'm not allowed to work the land, besides for the issue of working the land, there's also a restriction, a din, a mitzvah's essay to ensure that the ground rests, to make sure that it doesn't perform work. And that's why in the case where I planted before the Shemitah year, I didn't do anything wrong. But if the ground is going to be producing and working with the seeds and making them take root during the Shemitah, then I'm doing the wrong thing. I have to make sure that it doesn't do that. I have to go uproot the tree. But yet here we're seeing all these indications in the laws of Shemitah, svichim, or things that grow by themselves, that I'm not restricted from making sure that such a thing doesn't happen. So how do we understand that? If there is a din of shav sa'ar chavas lashem, that we have to make sure that the ground rests and doesn't do anything for me, then how do we allow that to happen? How do we allow all these things to grow by themselves during the Shemitah year? So to answer this question, I think it's important to get more into the parallel which the Minchas Chinuch was drawing from Shvisas Behema, the halacha that on Shabbos, not only am I restricted from working, but there is a din as well that I have to make sure that that my animals don't do work on during the Shemitah year. And in that case, this is an interesting question, hotly debated in the poskim. It's very hard to get a final conclusion to this. But the big question is, do I have to really make sure that my animal doesn't do any malacha whatsoever on Shabbos? Let me give you an interesting, a scenario just to bring out the point. Let's say, you're learning Bava Kama at certain points and you see animals doing all sorts of wild, damaging things on Shabbos. So let's say I have a backyard, I have a forest, and I see that my ox on Shabbos is going and ripping through the forest, and he's uprooting twigs from the ground. He's being kotzer. To knock down twigs that are growing from a tree is very much forbidden. Right? You're not allowed to do such a thing. You're not allowed to knock down twigs from a tree that are growing. That's kotzer. That's detaching something from its place of growth on Shabbos. So let's say I notice, I'm sitting there by my Shabbos meal. I look out the window and I see my cow is doing that in the backyard. Do I have to go stop it? Right? There's a law of Shvisas Behema. I'm supposed to do Shvisas Behema. I'm supposed to make sure that my animals are resting on Shabbos. So I really have to make sure that my animals are resting on Shabbos. Am I allowed to watch my animal do that? So I have to go outside and make sure that he doesn't do such a thing. So this is a very difficult question. It seems that there's a bit of a split in the Achronim / Poskim about how we look at this. There are those who say, no, of course you don't have to stop the animal from doing it. Because the whole essence of the Isser of Shvisas Behema, that we have to make sure that our animals are resting and not working for us, the whole point is that they're not allowed to do malacha for us. The whole point is that they can't be working for you. The idea like behind it is, it's one thing to say, you're not working, but if you could have all your employees working for you on Shabbos, so you're also busy working, right? You got all this malacha being done for you. So the Torah is saying that besides for the fact that you have to make sure that you're not doing the ma'aseh malacha, you can't have your animals working on your behalf, so to speak. So the Isra is, with you and your animals, don't have your animals be working for you on your behalf. But if it's not on your behalf, it's not being done for you, you're not restricted. You don't have to make sure that your animal doesn't do any random malacha that it wants to do on Shabbos. If it wants to, it has a fit of rage and it's romping through the forest, knocking off twigs from the trees, so be it. What have I done wrong? I don't have to stop an animal from doing such a thing. And according to this perspective, if you think about the entire 5th chapter of Masechah Shabbos, that an animal is restricted from carrying things on Shabbos that would be like a burden, things that are not part of its body, things that aren't accessorizing its body, other random things that it is carrying. According to this perspective, it seems that we have to say that, all of those cases there in the Mishnayos have to be talking about the fact that it's doing it for its owner. That might be actually a pretty forced thing to say, but it seems that there definitely is such a perspective in the Achronim and Poskim that the halacha of Shvisas Behema doesn't restrict an animal from working. It restricts the animal from working for me on my behalf. Now, the problem with this perspective is that there's a Taisvus in Shabbos and Daf Kuf Chav Beis, and the Gemara is talking about if I have a cow and wants to eat, it's hungry, so there's grass. So how does a cow eat grass? It goes to the grass and it puts its head down, it bends down, and it eats. And when it does that, what it's doing is that it's uprooting in that moment. It's uprooting the grass from the ground. That's what it's doing. So it's an act of kotzer. So it says that we're allowed, at least definitely midaraisa, having such a thing. You're allowed to watch. You are allowed to watch your cow graze on Shabbos and eat the grass. Well, wait a second. Isn't that exactly precisely the question that we're saying? So if you're allowed to do that, isn't that compelling evidence that this perspective, again, is correct? That it's not also to stop it from doing malacha. It's only also to stop it from doing malacha on the owner's behalf. However, if you take a look at the Tosos there in Shabbos, Daf Kuf Chav Beis, Tosos quotes a Mechilta. And the Mechilta, which again is like the halachic medrash, which is coming to give the source for why one is allowed to make sure that his animal, that one is in fact allowed to watch his animal pluck the grass from the ground. So the Mechilta says that look at the language of the pasuk. The language of the pasuk, when it says that you have to make sure that not only are you not doing malacha, but that your animals and your whole household as well is not doing malacha, the pasuk says, "Lema'an yanuach sharcha v'chamarcha kamocha," so that your ox and your donkey, leman yanuach, that they should rest just like you, just like you're resting. Leman yanuach sharcha v'chamarcha kamocha, they should be resting as well. Continues the Mechilta. The whole point is that they should be resting. In this scenario, if I'm going to withhold my animal from grazing, if I'm going to say, no, Betsy, you're not allowed to graze today. You're not allowed to put your head down and eat the grass. Is the language of the Mechilta. This is not rest for the animal. This is not moments of serenity for the animal. It's not like me enjoying my Shabbos by not working. This is sa'ar. This is painful to the animal. If I have to restrict an animal from eating, from grazing naturally the way it wants to, well, that would be straight up, that would be textbook sa'ar. That would be pain for the animal. So since that would be pain for the animal, I don't have to stop it from doing such a thing. So what is the Mechilta telling us? The Mechilta is telling us a subtlety. Even though I have to, in fact, make sure that my animals don't work for me on Shabbos, and there is such a halacha, but the type of work that I have to restrict it from is the type of work which would bring a pleasant rest to the animal. If I don't make it work in the plow and out there and pulling the plow, well, the animal's resting, it's enjoying its day more. It's more at peace, it's ease. Just like I'm resting, so too my animal's resting. That I have to do. But if my restrictions that I place upon my animal are going to place it in pain, it wants to eat, and I'm not going to allow it to eat, I'm not providing serenity, I'm not giving noach, I'm not giving peace here to the animal. All I'm really doing is putting it in pain. And since all I'm doing is putting it in pain, I don't have to restrict. Now, in that scenario, was the animal eating grass for me? Was it eating grass on my behalf? Not at all. It wasn't eating grass on my behalf. It was eating grass on its behalf. It was eating grass because it was hungry. And the only reason why I'm allowed to let it eat grass is because of this new drasha that the Mechilta is making, that ein zeh noach alatzah. The reason I don't have to stop it is because it wouldn't bring a peace. To the opposite, to the contrary, it would put itself in pain. If it's true that the entire essence of Lamanya Nuach is only not to allow the animals to do malacha on one's behalf, then we should have said a much simpler reason why the animal is allowed to graze on Shabbos. I don't have to stop it. The reason I don't have to stop it is because it's not doing it for me. It's not on my behalf. It's not eating it for me. It's not good for me. That's not the point of what it's doing. It's eating for itself. That's not what the Mechilta is saying. The Mechilta is not saying that the reason I don't have to stop it is because it's not for me. The reason the Mechilta is saying I don't have to stop it is because if I stop it, it's going to put the animal in pain. That's a very different subtlety. There's a different point. If the Achronim are right, that every time it says in Shabbos that an animal can't go out carrying a certain thing, it's only when it's carrying it on behalf of the owner, then in our case, it would seem that it would be obvious that the animal can eat here because it's not doing it for me. Now, what is it oozing to say? That, we have to tone it down a little bit. It's not about the fact that the animal is doing it for me on my behalf. That's not the key. And I would also steer away of saying that the key isn't whether it's doing it and you happen to have benefit from it either. If you circumstantially happen to have benefit, it still doesn't define what the animal is doing. The animal isn't eating to save me money on animals. The animal is eating, the definition of its maisa is still for itself. But perhaps what we can say is something a little bit different. When an animal does something for its common needs, whenever it's doing something for satisfy its needs, that's also part of what I'm restricted to. Whatever it's being done lidato, for example, it's hungry and it wants to eat, and theoretically I should be restricted for that. It's not that it's restricted to have an animal do malacha for me on my behalf. That's true. We're going to assume that was too much of an extreme statement. Even when it's not on my behalf, it's still forbidden. But it's restricted for me to make sure, I have to make sure that just as I don't go ahead and do malacha, my animal doesn't do malacha. But the types of things that I have to restrict my animal for are things that are animal needs, things that an animal would do. Not something which an animal happened to randomly do, but something which thoughtfully an animal is doing. Not something on a whim. An animal happens to do something. I happen to notice that my cow is outside and is knocking down a twig. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no ifser, because that's not something which is any das intent in there and there to happen. The animal, whatever reason it's on a whim and would like to do it. But there's no needs of the animal to do such a thing. And if there's no needs to do that, then we don't view that maisa as an important maisa. We just say it happened and the animal is knocking down twigs, but first of all, it's not on your behalf. Not only is it not on your behalf, it's not being done as the animal needs. So it happened, but I don't have to make sure a cow doesn't do anything at all. But I have to make sure that my animal's needs are not happening on Shabbos. I have to make sure the same way I don't take care of my needs, the animal doesn't take care of its needs. It's completely at rest. But in any mindless actions that happen to occur that an animal does, I don't have to necessarily stop it from doing it. That I think would be more of like a compromise, more of a conservative approach here to understand what types of things I restrict my animal from and what types of things I don't have to. If we apply this back to the idea and we understand the Minchas Chinuch analogy to making sure that the ground is resting during Shmitta, the same thing can be said. I don't have to stop my ground from working by itself on Shabbos. You can't shut down soil. There's no such thing. You don't have to go out there and police the fact that your ground is working by itself. It's naturally going to do what it's going to do. There will be wild things that will grow. There's going to be sfichim. There's just going to be some seeds which are there by itself and will happen to grow. All of these things are going to occur. I can't put the ground on lockdown. I can't do that. The same way I'm not expected on Shabbos to make sure that my animal doesn't do anything. But that's not what it is. But what I do have to make sure is that the ground is not working for me. So what does that mean to say that the ground isn't working for me? If I put in a seed before the Shmitta, well, now it's as if, think about it, it's as if I'm telling the ground, go to work for me. I put the seed in. I want you now to take root of it. I want you to make it grow. I want you to work with it. Once that happens, all right, now we have a tremendous issue here. Now that the ground is working, we see it's working from your maisa. It's taking your maisa and working for you. That I'm restricted from doing. But if the land is just naturally working, I don't have to get out there and be shomer and police the fact. I don't necessarily have to stop it from doing such a thing. Perhaps that would be a nice way of understanding this sugya through relating it to the analogy of Shavisas Abihim. I will leave you with a question that I'm struggling with. I don't have a great answer for it, although I do think there are many good thoughts that can be said to answer it. What would happen if I planted something and it took effect and it took root and it's growing. And you know what? Maybe it's even mostly grown. It's a third grown or even mostly grown before Shmita. There, I think everybody agrees. I've never heard of the Chiddush that I have to make sure that it doesn't grow more during the Shemitah year. Why don't I have to make sure that it doesn't grow more during the Shemitah year? Why is the restriction only to make sure that a klita doesn't happen, that it's a rooting doesn't take place? Why is that? If the nature of this idea why I have to make sure that a klita doesn't happen is because if the ground is working for me by taking root of it, it's doing work for me during the Shemitah, then even if it took root and even if it was already growing before Shemitah, why don't I have to make sure that it doesn't grow more during the Shemitah? It's growing more for me. It's making it more ripe, more further produced, more mature grain. Why don't I have to make sure that the ground doesn't do that? The same way I cannot put the seed in and make it and intend that the ground will take it and take root of it during the Shemitah. Why is it only specific to the act of taking root? Why can't we say that there is such a thing as well, which comes with growing further? And we do not find that, and there's evidence to the contrary. Nobody is saying that if it took root before the Shemitah year, it cannot grow further during the Shemitah year. That would be taking, I think, the Minchas Chinuch Chiddush much further than the way he wanted it ever to be said. But the question is to think about precisely why not? Why don't we say that the same thing would be true if it would be going further? So I'll make a quick summary of the things that we discussed. We had today in the Daf Yomi an absolute man-boggling Chiddush that even if a person is planting something ahead of the Shemitah, if it's taking root during the Shemitah, it seems that there's wrongdoing. Ya'akar, it has to be uprooted. This was the novelty. According to Rashi, the Gemara is super clear. Even if this is taking place before the time of Tosefes Shvius, but even if this man of Tosefes Shvius is taking root, there's a halacha of Ya'akar. It's a very hard idea. I'm not planting during the Shemitah year. So we delved into a whole discussion about what exactly is planting. Is planting the act of putting something into the ground, or is it only when the effect takes place? We spoke about that in regard to Shabbos. If I put something in the ground, the Minchas Chinuch's question, how am I liable on Shabbos? We spoke about the Minchas Chinuch's Chiddush, that even without any effect, just planting something unto itself, that is an act of planting. If I plant something on Shabbos, even without effect, that's planting. If I plant something at the end of Shemitah, that's a problem that I planted it even without it taking effect on Shemitah. Let's say if I planted it at the end. But after we discussed all of that, we came back to the Gemara and we realized that we have the inverse of this. We have something taking effect on the Shemitah year, but you're not planting it during the Shemitah year. We have the Minchas Chinuch telling us that that's also usher. Klita is as if you're planting it again. What does that mean? Klita as if you're planting it again. Is that really? Am I not allowed to plant ahead of Shabbos? If it's going to be niklat on Shabbos, it's going to be like I'm planting on Shabbos. Is that true? And Minchas Chinuch is telling us, no, don't look at it that way. Look at it as a specific chiddush within the novelties of the laws of Shmita. That besides for the Isser to work the land, you have to make sure that the land doesn't work. And that's the Isser. If I'm going to plant it ahead, if they will be niklat during Shemitah, the land will have worked for me during Shemitah. We discussed what exactly the nature of that is. Does it mean I have to protect the ground? I have to police it not to work at all? We have many indications that it's not that way. We draw the parallel to Shvisas HaBehema. We come up with some certain definitions, working definitions for what I have to police and what I do not have to police. And then we're leaving off with an interesting question, which is why do I have to make sure that it doesn't make a klita, but I do not have to make sure that it doesn't grow any further?